He growled every night, not in anger, but as a warning. When the truth was revealed, they were shocked and grateful to him. Sometimes God sends his angels with fur and 4 legs. The first true winter winds swept across Cheyenne, Wyoming, carrying with them the scent of frozen earth and distant pine. In this part of the country, the sky was an endless, aching blue by day and a sea of glittering frost by night. Snow blanketed the fields like a heavy sigh, and the barren trees bent under the pressure of the relentless prairie wind. Against this backdrop of stark beauty stood the Carter family's new beginning, a weather-beaten farmhouse at the end of a long, rutted lane surrounded by acres of lonely land and the ceaseless whispering of grass. Jake Carter, a rugged man in his late 30s, unloaded the last box from their battered pickup truck. His military past was etched into every movement, economical and precise, and the faded scars along his jawline hinted at battles fought both abroad and within. His broad shoulders carried more than furniture. They bore the weight of unspoken promises of safety, of better days ahead. Despite the harshness carved into his features, his pale blue eyes held a surprising softness when he looked at his wife and daughter. Emily Carter, standing by the sagging porch steps, clutched their 10-month-old daughter Ellie to her chest. Emily was a slender woman, her long chestnut hair tucked into a woolen cap. Her green eyes, once vibrant, now dulled by grief. She had been a joyful soul, once a kindergarten teacher who sang more than she spoke. But losing her mother to a swift, brutal illness had hollowed her. The memory of hospital rooms heavy with disinfectant and final goodbyes clung to her like a second skin. Her every glance toward Ellie was tinged with fear, as if fate might again reach out with its cruel hand. At Emily's feet sat Ranger, their 5-year-old German shepherd, thick-furred and proud. His sable coat glistened under the waning light, and his amber eyes missed nothing. Ranger had once been Jake's only companion during the long, harrowing months stationed overseas, and he carried himself with the disciplined vigilance of a soldier, yet his heart beat fiercely for his family. That evening, as the wind moaned and rattled the old farmhouse's loose shingles, Jake built a fire in the crumbling stone hearth, while Emily prepared a modest dinner of canned soup and toast. Ellie, bundled in hand-knitted blankets, gurgled happily in her playpen. Ranger lay near the fire, at first his great head resting on his paws, but his ears flicked constantly alert to every sound the old house made as it settled and sighed in the deepening cold. Night came swiftly swallowing the plains in icy darkness. As they climbed the creaking stairs to bed, Emily couldn't shake a growing unease. She chalked it up to exhaustion, to grief, to the alien sounds of an unfamiliar house. Jake collapsed into bed within minutes, snoring softly while Emily stared at the ceiling, the quilt her mother had sewn decades ago, clutched in her fists. It was just past midnight when she heard a low, guttural growl that vibrated through the floorboards and sent her heart lurching into her throat. For one terrifying moment, she thought some wild animal had broken into the house. She bolted upright and rushed toward Ellie's nursery, nearly tripping on the hem of her nightgown. There, illuminated by the cold blue glow of the moon filtering through frosted windows, was Ranger. He stood rigid beside Ellie's crib. Hackles raised, his lips peeled back in a silent, warning growl. His eyes were not on Ellie, but on something beyond something Emily could not see. Frozen by fear and maternal instinct, Emily hurried to scoop Ranger away from the crib. He resisted, muscles taut, but allowed her to guide him out after a long, reluctant moment. Ellie slept undisturbed, her tiny breaths misting in the chilled air. Jake stumbled in moments later, confused and disoriented. "What's wrong?" he mumbled, rubbing his eyes. Ranger was growling. At Ellie's crib, Emily whispered, still trembling. Jake frowned, kneeling to inspect Ranger, who stood with every fiber of his being tense. His eyes locked back on the crib, even as he obeyed Jake's gentle hand on his collar. There was no injury, no madness in his gaze, only a fierce, silent purpose. Maybe it's just the move, Jake offered half-heartedly. Maybe he's just unsettled. Emily nodded, but her heart disagreed. Something had shifted in the house, something she could feel humming in her bones. The next morning, Cheyenne awoke beneath a sullen gray sky. Wind swept thin flurries across the open fields, and the sun struggled to pierce the heavy cloud cover. Jake spent the day securing loose shutters and patching drafty windows, while Emily busied herself inside cleaning the musty rooms and airing out the linens. Ranger followed her from room to room, never more than a few feet from Ellie at any time. By midday, Emily decided to drive into town for supplies. The old Ford grumbled to life, and she bundled Ellie into the back seat, tucking a fleece blanket around her. Ranger watched from the window with an intensity that made Emily shiver. Cheyenne's downtown was a sleepy collection of brick buildings and neon signs. At the general store, Emily met Mrs. Harriet Collins, a plump woman with wiry gray hair and a sharp tongue who had run the store for as long as anyone could remember. Mrs. Collins gave Emily a speculative glance over her spectacles as she rang up canned beans, diapers, and coffee. "You're out at the Turner place, aren't you?" she said, more statement than question. "Yes, just moved in," Emily replied, forcing cheer into her voice. Mrs. Collins grunted. "Old land, old bones. Sometimes they don't like being disturbed." Emily laughed nervously, not knowing whether to take the comment as superstition or simple country wisdom. Back home, as twilight melted into another bruised night, the feeling of disquiet returned. After putting Ellie to bed, Emily sat by the fire, stitching a torn sleeve absent-mindedly. Ranger dozed, but stirred whenever Ellie coughed or whimpered, lifting his massive head and listening so intently that Emily found herself holding her breath alongside him. When she finally slipped under the quilt, the house groaned under the weight of the gathering storm outside. Somewhere deep in sleep, Emily thought she heard a whisper, a voice so beloved and so lost it tore at her soul. "Stay close. Watch her." She woke with a jolt, clutching at the air. Ranger sat at the foot of the bed, his eyes gleaming in the moonlight. No sound save the wind, no movement save the restless shifting of snow across the frozen earth. Yet Emily knew with the certainty born of grief and mother's instinct that something unseen had crossed the threshold of their lives. And again from the nursery that low, deliberate growl echoed through the hollow house. The next few nights on the Wyoming prairie were a mirror of the first, bitterly cold, cloaked in a silence so complete that even the ticking of the old grandfather clock in the hallway sounded deafening. The wind prowled the fields like a living thing, rattling the loose shutters and seeping through the smallest cracks in the farmhouse. Inside, the Carters tried to settle into their new rhythm, but peace remained elusive. Every night, precisely around the same ghostly hour, Ranger began his ritual. The growling would start low, deep in his chest, rising in volume and intensity as he planted himself firmly by Ellie's crib. He never barked, never snarled, but his entire body tensed, as if ready to defend against an enemy unseen. Emily, frazzled by sleep deprivation and gnawed by ever-growing anxiety, would lead Ranger out each time, her heart torn between fear and guilt. Jake, usually the one who met challenges head-on, found himself rattled. A veteran of 2 deployments overseas, he was a man who could once sleep through mortar fire, but now woke, drenched in sweat, the echoes of nightmares still howling in his ears. In those dreams, the prairie wind turned into whispers, low, urgent, almost pleading. The faces of comrades long gone floated in and out of sight, mouths moving without sound, always pointing toward Ellie's room. One particularly raw morning, after a night of relentless growling and fractured sleep, Jake stumbled into the kitchen, rubbing his temples. The clock showed 5:32 a.m. Emily, already seated at the worn oak table, cradled a cup of coffee between trembling hands. Her eyes were rimmed with red, her hair a tangled mess she hadn't bothered to brush. "We have to do something about Ranger," she said hoarsely. Jake sighed, his breath fogging in the cold kitchen. "He's healthy. He's not aggressive. Maybe he's, I don't know, protecting her from something we can't sense." Emily shook her head, tears spilling over. "Or he's losing his mind." They decided to bring in a local dog trainer for advice. Enter Tom Grady, a middle-aged man with a face like cracked leather and a voice so low it seemed to rumble from the earth itself. Tom had spent 30 years working with ranch dogs across Wyoming, teaching them to herd guard and, when necessary, protect. When Tom arrived in the farmhouse that afternoon, he looked every inch the part. Faded jeans tucked into scuffed boots, a shearling coat too big for his wiry frame, and a battered Stetson pulled low over gray-streaked hair. His deep-set brown eyes, however, were surprisingly gentle as he knelt to greet Ranger, who approached him with cautious curiosity. "He's a fine dog," Tom said after a few minutes, scratching behind Ranger's ears. "Focused, alert, not aggressive unless he has a reason to be." Jake and Emily exchanged uneasy glances. "What reason could there be?" Emily asked, her voice breaking slightly. Tom straightened up, brushing snow from his knees. "Dogs hear what we can't, smell what we can't. Sometimes they know things before we ever get a hint." "But there's nothing wrong with the house," Jake said, almost pleading. Tom shrugged. "Maybe not. Maybe something's wrong with the land." Later that evening, as Jake chopped firewood behind the house, he noticed something strange. A patch of ground near the back of the property where the snow never seemed to stick. It was a small thing, a circle no wider than a man's arms stretched, but the earth there remained bare, dark, and oddly warm to the touch. The discovery unsettled him more than he cared to admit. That night, as Emily rocked Ellie to sleep with a lullaby she half remembered from childhood, Jake sat by the fire staring into the flames. His mind drifted again to the dreams, the whispering wind, the unseen warnings, and he shuddered despite the heat. Ranger remained restless, pacing between the living room and the nursery, his claws clicking softly against the old wooden floors. As the clock struck midnight, the growl returned, vibrating low and ominous through the floorboards. Jake rose and followed Ranger, his heart hammering. He found the dog once again stationed at Ellie's crib, ears forward, body taut. Ellie slept undisturbed, her tiny fists curled against her cheeks. For a long moment, Jake stood there listening not to Ranger's growl, but to something deeper. The house itself seemed to hum, as if vibrating with some secret only the oldest timber remembered. The next morning they awoke to find new, finer cracks splitting the walls of the nursery. The foundation, perhaps disturbed by decades of shifting soil, was shifting again. Emily ran her fingers over one crack, her face pale. "We're not imagining this," she whispered. Jake nodded grimly. "No, we're not." For the first time he allowed the thought to take root. Maybe Ranger's growling wasn't a problem to be solved. Maybe it was a warning they were too blind, too stubborn to understand. The cold deepened. The days grew shorter, the nights longer. Jake's nightmares intensified dreams where he wandered a frozen field while distant figures called his name, voices twisted by the wind. Sometimes he saw Ellie ahead, toddling on unsteady legs, reaching out for something he couldn't see. Every time he tried to reach her, the ground crumbled under his feet. Emily, too, found herself haunted not only by the living, but by the dead. She heard her mother's voice often in her lighter sleeps, a soft insistence to trust her instincts, to listen to the things beyond reason. It scared her how much she wanted to believe. And through it all, Ranger remained the sentinel, growling, warning, waiting. Whatever was coming, Jake realized, was already inside the house. They just hadn't recognized it yet. The days slipped by under a sky the color of frozen steel. Winter's breath seemed endless across the Wyoming plains, and the Carter farmhouse, with its aging timbers and drafty walls, groaned under the constant weight of the wind. Despite Tom Grady's reassurances that Ranger was simply being vigilant, Emily couldn't shake the unease that clung to her like a second skin. Every night without fail, Ranger would growl low by Ellie's crib, and every night Emily would jolt awake, heart-hammering, feeling the house vibrate with some unknown tension. Jake decided it was time for a second opinion. They drove into town with Ranger bundled in the back of the truck, his golden eyes alert, head resting heavily between his paws. The veterinary clinic sat on the edge of Cheyenne, a squat brick building with a faded sign swinging in the frigid breeze. Inside it smelled sharply of antiseptic and wet fur. Dr. Martha Green welcomed them at the door. A tall woman with graying red hair pulled into a practical ponytail, Martha had the no-nonsense air of someone who had spent a lifetime patching up farm animals in blizzards and dust storms alike. Her crow's feet deepened when she smiled, but her sharp green eyes missed nothing. She crouched to greet Ranger, her movements slow and confident. "Well, aren't you a handsome boy?" she said, running her hands expertly along his spine, checking his joints, his teeth, his heart. Ranger stood patiently, tail held still but not tucked, exuding quiet strength. After a thorough examination, Martha straightened and wiped her hands on a towel. "He's in perfect health," she declared. "No neurological issues, no infections. His behavior seems more environmental than medical." Jake frowned. "Environmental?" Martha nodded thoughtfully. "Dogs are sensitive to shifts in the earth, to sounds we can't hear, changes in pressure. Something might be bothering him, something you or I wouldn't notice until it's too late." The words hung heavily between them. As they drove home, Jake kept stealing glances at the dashboard. Every few seconds, he thought he felt something, an almost imperceptible tremor beneath the wheels, like the earth itself was breathing slowly, heavily, far below their tires. He didn't mention it to Emily. Not yet. That night, as twilight surrendered to the black maw of another Wyoming winter's night, Jake sat on the living room floor, pretending to read, while Ranger lay curled at his side. Emily rocked Ellie upstairs, singing an old lullaby under her breath. The fire cracked and spat in the hearth, filling the room with its sleepy orange light. Yet Jake couldn't shake the feeling that the house was subtly shifting beneath them like a boat riding some unseen tide. Upstairs, Emily noticed something new. As she laid Ellie into her crib, the baby girl, usually drowsy and whimpering at bedtime, suddenly let out a peal of laughter. Not the dreamy coos of a half-asleep infant, but clear, joyous laughter, as if someone had just played a game of peekaboo. Emily froze, goosebumps prickling along her arms. Ellie giggled again, eyes wide open, focused not on her mother, but on the empty air above her crib. Her chubby hands stretched up, grasping at something unseen, heart-pounding. Emily whispered, "Ellie, what do you see?" Of course, there was no answer. Only the sound of the wind clawing at the shutters. Emily backed out of the room, leaving the door slightly ajar. Downstairs, she found Jake sitting stiffly by the fire. Ranger now fully awake, his ears pricked forward, body tense. I think she's seeing something," Emily said in a low voice. Jake set down his book, the lines of worry on his face deepening. He shared his suspicions about the subtle tremors he had begun to notice. Emily listened, pale and silent, as he described the sensation of the earth pulsing under their home. The following afternoon, Jake decided to investigate. Armed with a heavy flashlight and stubborn resolve, he made his way to the old cellar door behind the house, a door so weather-beaten it looked as if it might dissolve into splinters at a touch. Ranger padded after him, head low, hackles slightly raised. The cellar smelled of damp earth and old wood. Jake descended carefully the rickety steps, groaning under his weight. His flashlight beam caught on rusted tools, broken furniture, forgotten crates, and something else, a jagged crack running along the concrete floor, just barely visible beneath a scattering of dirt and straw. Jake crouched, brushing the debris aside. The crack was wide enough to slide a hand into, and it ran straight toward the foundations of the house. He laid his palm flat against the ground. It was warmer than the surrounding air. He didn't know what it meant, not exactly, but he knew one thing. The land here was shifting, breathing, changing. Upstairs, Emily tried to maintain normalcy. She set Ellie in her high chair, spooning mashed peas into her mouth while humming softly. But Ellie kept glancing past her, laughing at empty corners, reaching out to air. Every time she did, Emily's heart squeezed painfully. Later that night, after they had tucked Ellie into bed and triple-checked the locks and windows, Jake told Emily about the crack in the cellar. Her face turned the color of ash. "We have to leave," she said. Jake shook his head. "And go where? This is everything we have." Emily didn't argue. She understood what he meant, but understanding didn't quell the growing dread in her gut. Midnight came. The house slept uneasily. Ranger, ever vigilant, took his post at Ellie's door. Emily drifted in and out of a restless sleep, dreams filled with her mother's voice warning urging. When the growl came, it was different this time, lower, angrier. It vibrated through the walls. Jake woke with a start, reaching instinctively for the baseball bat he kept under the bed. He stumbled into the hallway to find Ranger standing stiffly outside the nursery, teeth bared at nothing. Jake opened the door slowly. Ellie was awake, sitting upright in her crib, laughing, clapping her tiny hands. And on the floor near the crib was a wet, dark stain slowly seeping from between the floorboards. The air grew colder with each passing night, a bitterness that seemed to seep into the bones of the house itself. The Carter farmhouse, isolated and battered by the relentless Wyoming winds, had become a place where silence was no longer a comfort, but a presence in itself, thick-heavy and waiting. After the unsettling discovery of the dark stain on Ellie's floor, Jake decided they needed tangible evidence. They purchased an inexpensive baby monitor equipped with a camera and sound recorder from the town's modest electronics shop, a dusty place run by Mr. Howard Jenkins, an elderly man with a stooped back, a hawkish nose, and a voice like dry leaves. Howard had lived his entire life in Cheyenne and carried with him an air of weary patience, as if he had long ago resigned himself to the strange currents that sometimes swept through old lands like theirs. Jake and Emily set the camera in Ellie's nursery that night, angling it carefully to capture the entire crib and the surrounding area. Ranger sat vigil, as always, a silent statue of fur and muscle. Emily lingered longer than usual, reluctant to leave her daughter alone, even with the technology watching over her. Eventually, they retreated to their bedroom, exhausted but anxious. The night unfolded much as it had before. The wind moaned around the corners of the house. The wood beams creaked under invisible pressures. Somewhere far off, a coyote cried out, the sound carrying over the frozen fields like a ghost's lament. At midnight, Ranger growled. Deep, low, relentless. Jake and Emily stared at the monitor screen, hearts pounding. The nursery appeared calm. Ellie slept peacefully, the mobile above her crib, spinning slightly in the drafty air. Ranger stood by the door, rigid ears pinned forward. He stared at the crib, not in confusion, but in absolute focus, the same way a soldier might lock eyes on an unseen threat across a battlefield. But the camera picked up nothing else. No shadow moved across the wall. No strange noises marred the audio feed. Only Ranger's soft growl, barely audible but steady like a warning only he could hear. Emily shivered and drew the quilt tighter around her shoulders. Jake sat unmoving, his face carved into a mask of helpless frustration. The next morning, Emily tried to dismiss it. She needed normalcy, needed to believe that life could right itself again. She dressed Ellie in a thick, hand-knitted sweater, a relic from her mother's craft drawer, and carried her outside to gather firewood with Jake. It was while they were outside, bundled against the cutting wind, that Emily saw it. Perched on the bare branch of the dying elm, just beyond Ellie's nursery window, was a white owl, a barn owl, its heart-shaped face stark against the deepening gray of the afternoon sky. It was a magnificent creature, larger than she would have expected, with feathers so pale they seemed almost to glow in the dim light. It watched them with an uncanny stillness, its black eyes deep wells of knowing. Emily nudged Jake, pointing silently. Ranger saw it too. His ears pricked, his body tensed, but he did not bark. He only stared, tail stiff behind him. The owl stayed long after they returned indoors, unmoving, as if carved from ice. That night, the owl was there again and again the next, always at the same perch, always at the same hour, midnight. Emily couldn't ignore it. She remembered stories her mother had told her as a child, legends of the Great Plains about white owls serving as guardians, messengers from the spirit world. Some said they were protectors. Others whispered they were harbingers of great change of endings and beginnings. Unable to sleep, she turned to someone who might know more. Mrs. Harriet Collins, the sharp-tongued shopkeeper from town, had lived in Wyoming all her life and was a quiet collector of local lore. Emily visited her under the pretense of needing supplies, but quickly steered the conversation toward the owl. Harriet listened, arms crossed over her stout chest, one eyebrow raised. "A barn owl, you say?" "White as snow?" she asked, voice low. Emily nodded. Harriet pursed her lips, considering. "Some folks say they're watchers, silent guardians. They appear when something precious is threatened." Her eyes softened slightly, the sharpness falling away for a moment. "Or when a soul needs help crossing from one world to the next." Emily's heart twisted painfully. Back at the farmhouse, Jake inspected the cellar again, trying to find some explanation for the shifting ground and strange occurrences. The crack in the floor seemed wider than before, and there was a faint, almost sulphurous smell lingering in the damp air. Upstairs, Ellie's behaviors grew stranger. She no longer simply laughed into the empty air. She now babbled animatedly as if conversing with an invisible friend. She pointed often at the window where the owl sat giggling with the boundless trust of innocence. Jake and Emily found themselves more divided by the day. Jake clung to logical explanations, faulty wiring, shifting foundations, carbon monoxide leaks, while Emily leaned closer to the terrifying idea that something beyond science was unfolding around them. One night, as Emily sat by the crib humming a lullaby, she noticed Ranger stiffen. His growl vibrated against her spine. She looked toward the window. The owl was there, but it wasn't alone. There, just beyond the fence line, shadows moved, subtle, slow-like figures wandering without purpose. She blinked, and they were gone. Emily gathered Ellie into her arms, heart thundering. She didn't tell Jake about the shadows. Not yet. Instead, she lay awake, listening to the soft growl of the only guardian she trusted anymore. The ground had begun to whisper. It was subtle at first, an almost imperceptible hum that seemed to radiate through the floorboards at odd hours when the wind died and the world held its breath. Jake felt it most keenly when he was alone walking the perimeter of the property at dusk, or sitting quietly in the cellar staring at the widening cracks that marred the foundation. He didn't tell Emily about the vibrations, at first afraid of burdening her more than she already was. But deep down, he knew that whatever was happening here was more than just the natural settling of an old house. The white owl returned every night now, always at the same branch, always watching. Ranger grew more restless with each passing evening, pacing the hallways, ears flicking toward sounds only he could perceive. Ellie continued to laugh and babble at invisible companions, her tiny hands reaching out to nothingness. Jake realized they needed answers, not just theories. It was Emily who suggested they talk to Mr. Walker. Samuel Walker lived half a mile down the old dirt road in a low, ramshackle house with a porch that sagged like an old man's shoulders. He was a man of about 70, with a wiry frame wrapped in layers of flannel and denim. His skin was weathered to leather by decades under the Wyoming sun, and his eyes, pale blue, almost translucent, had the faraway look of someone who had seen more loss than life. His gait was uneven, favoring his left side, the result of an accident many years ago that he never discussed. Mr. Walker had a reputation around town. Some said he was just a lonely old man with too many ghosts. Others whispered that he knew things about the land, things better left forgotten. Jake and Emily found him sitting on his porch, a battered thermos steaming in his hands, his gaze fixed on the endless stretch of prairie. Ranger, usually cautious around strangers, approached him without hesitation, sniffing the old man's boots and giving a low whine of approval. Afternoon Walker greeted them without looking away from the horizon. Mr. Walker, Jake began shifting uncomfortably. "We were hoping to ask you about something strange." Walker finally turned his gaze toward them, and Jake felt the weight of that ancient sadness settle on his shoulders. "You're in the Turner place," Walker said, not a question, but a statement. Emily nodded. We've been hearing things, feeling things, and our dog, he's been warning us." Walker took a long sip from his thermos before speaking again. "There's a fault line runs deep under that stretch of land," he said slowly. "A breathing place, some call it. Natural gas pockets, methane, shifts in the earth. Most days it's harmless, but sometimes when the seasons change and the ground gets restless, things happen." Jake exchanged a grim look with Emily, like what Walker's face tightened, the lines around his mouth deepening. "When I was a boy," he said, voice rough with memory, "my sister and her family lived in that house. Had a little girl, Clara, bright as a button, sweet laugh like bells." He paused, staring into his coffee as if he could see the past swirling inside. "One winter night about 30 years ago, Clara went to bed laughing just like your little one. By morning, she was gone." His voice broke slightly, a fissure in his stoic facade. "Gas buildup. No smell, no warning. Took her in her sleep." Emily's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes wide with horror. I'm so sorry," she whispered. Walker waved it off, but his hand trembled. "Nothing brings her back," he said. "But sometimes I see the signs, feel the tremors, smell the earth turning sour. That house, it breathes just like a living thing, and sometimes it exhales poison." Jake felt his knees weaken. The vibrations, the crack in the cellar, the strange behaviors. It wasn't superstition. It wasn't imagination. It was something real, and it was dangerous. Walker leaned forward, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "That owl you keep seeing? It's no accident. Folks around here used to believe white owls were guardians. They come when death is close, or when something precious needs protecting." He looked at Ellie, who sat bundled in Emily's arms, waving her tiny fists at a falling leaf. "You listen to your dog," Walker said fiercely. "And you listen to your gut. If that house tells you to run, you run." The ride back to the farmhouse was silent except for the crunch of tires on gravel. Jake's mind churned with Walker's words, with the image of a bright-eyed little girl stolen in the night by something no one could see. That night, Jake set up carbon monoxide detectors in every room. He checked the gas lines twice, then 3 times. He even considered taking a sledgehammer to the cellar floor to investigate further. Emily spent hours clutching Ellie to her chest, staring at the monitor, at the owl, at the shifting shadows that now seemed to creep along the walls in the corners of her vision. When midnight came, Ranger was already stationed by Ellie's crib, his growl low and constant. The earth beneath them vibrated not a violent quake, but a slow, steady pulse, as if the ground itself was breathing in the darkness. And from the cellar below, a soft, almost mournful sigh rose up through the floorboards, curling through the house like a ghost. Jake and Emily lay awake, their hands entwined, listening to the house breathe, praying it would not be its last breath. The night fell heavier than usual, a suffocating blanket of darkness that seemed to smother even the constant howling of the Wyoming winds. The farmhouse stood silent and trembling under a sky choked with clouds. No stars visible, only the deep, oppressive weight of something unseen pressing down from above and rising from beneath. Inside, Jake double-checked the carbon monoxide detectors before bed, tapping them, listening for the reassuring beep that signaled life. Emily, meanwhile, lingered by Ellie's crib, smoothing her daughter's golden curls with a trembling hand. Ellie had been fussier than usual that evening, drifting into an uneasy sleep, punctuated by small whimpers and restless tossing. Ranger lay stretched out across the nursery threshold, a living barrier between Ellie and whatever unseen forces prowled the night. Jake tried to read in bed, but found the words blurring before his eyes, his mind spinning with unease. Emily joined him, though her body remained taut, every muscle ready to spring at the slightest sound. "Maybe we should sleep in her room tonight," Emily whispered. Jake shook his head, guilt gnawing at him. "We can't jump at every shadow. The detectors are working. The gas lines are fine. We checked everything." But even as he said it, he wasn't sure he believed it. Somewhere between exhaustion and the desperate need for hope, they both fell into a fitful, shallow sleep. It was just after midnight when Ranger's growl sliced through the house sharper and more urgent than ever before. Jake jolted upright, heart pounding in his chest. Emily sat up too, gasping as if she had been underwater. Ranger was no longer at the door. His growl came from deep within the nursery. They raced down the hall, the old floorboards shuddering beneath their bare feet. The door to Ellie's room stood ajar. The soft glow of the nightlight cast long, trembling shadows across the walls. Ranger was standing on his hind legs, his massive paws braced against the side of the crib, his body tense and vibrating with a desperate energy. Jake lunged into the room, but Ranger barked sharply 1, 2, 3 times in rapid succession, an urgent alarm that froze Jake in his tracks. Emily reached the crib first. What she saw turned her blood to ice. Ellie was not moving. Her tiny chest, which should have been gently rising and falling with breath, was terrifyingly still. Her lips were tinged with a bluish hue, her little hands limp at her sides. For a heartbeat, the world stopped. "No!" Emily screamed, reaching into the crib. But before she could lift Ellie, Ranger did something astonishing. With a swift, precise movement, he pushed Ellie onto her side with his nose and gave a sharp, forceful nudge to her back just below her rib cage. Ellie coughed, a small, broken sound at first, then a desperate, gasping wail as she sucked in air and began to cry. Emily collapsed beside the crib, sobbing uncontrollably, scooping Ellie into her arms, clutching her daughter against her heart, as if to fuse them back together. Jake stumbled to the bedside, stunned beyond words, tears burning his eyes. Ranger sat back on his haunches, his sides heaving, his tongue lolling from his mouth in relief. His amber eyes never left Ellie. Minutes passed before either parent could move beyond shaking and weeping. Jake finally managed to wrap a trembling arm around Emily and Ellie, both pulling them close. Together they huddled on the nursery floor, feeling the fragile miracle of breath against their skin. Somewhere in the house the wind rattled a window, but none of them flinched. In that moment, the only thing that existed was the fierce, raw gratitude of the living. Later, as the adrenaline faded and Jake called the nearest hospital, arranging to rush Ellie in for evaluation, Emily sat with her daughter cradled against her, whispering prayers half remembered from childhood. As she rocked back and forth, her mind reached into the hazy corridors of memory, to a hospital room much like this night where her mother, frail and fading, had gripped her hand with surprising strength and whispered, "God sends us protectors, Em. You just have to trust them, even when you can't see what they fight against." Emily blinked back tears, looking down at Ranger, now lying across the threshold once more, his tail thumping once weakly as if he understood everything. "Thank you," Emily whispered aloud, not sure if she spoke to her mother, to God, or to the brave creature who had refused to give up on her daughter. In the hours that followed, as doctors confirmed that Ellie had suffered a brief but severe sleep apnea episode 1 that could have been fatal if not for immediate intervention, Jake and Emily found themselves shattered and remade all at once. The fragile threads that had been pulling them apart since their move, since Emily's grief and Jake's fears, began to grow into chasms between them, were woven back together by Ranger's fierce love. Before dawn they returned to the farmhouse, weary but whole. The owl was still there, perched in the skeletal branches outside Ellie's window, its head tilted slightly, waiting. Emily watched it too, and for the first time since her mother's death, she felt a tiny ember of peace ignite within her chest. They had been heard. They had been protected. And they were not alone. The morning after the terrifying ordeal felt unnaturally bright, the winter sun glinting coldly off the snow like shards of broken glass. Inside the farmhouse, however, the Carters moved as though underwater, their steps slow, their eyes heavy with exhaustion and fear. Jake spent most of the early hours inspecting every inch of the house, driven by a gnawing certainty that the unseen danger was still lurking close, waiting for another moment of weakness. Emily kept Ellie within arm's reach at all times, her protective instincts sharpened into a razor's edge. Ranger followed them both like a silent sentinel, his amber eyes, alert ears, swiveling at every sound. Jake decided it was time to go deeper, literally. He retrieved a crowbar and a heavy sledgehammer from the old tool shed and descended into the cellar. Ranger came with him, padding silently across the cracked concrete floor. The air down there was thicker now, carrying a faint metallic tang that made Jake's skin crawl. He knelt near the largest crack, the one that had widened steadily over the past few weeks, and with a grunt, he began prying at the edges. After nearly an hour of careful work, Jake uncovered a small cavity beneath the house. When he leaned closer, the smell hit him a noxious, sulfuric stench that made his stomach churn. He turned to Emily, who had come to the doorway, Ellie bundled tightly against her chest. "Get her out," Jake said, his voice urgent but calm. "Now." Emily didn't question him. She sprinted upstairs and into the freezing yard, clutching Ellie to her chest, her breath forming frantic clouds in the bitter air. Jake crouched lower and pulled a lighter from his pocket, a habit carried over from his army days. He flicked it to life and carefully extended it near the crack, far enough not to cause a direct explosion, but close enough to test the air. The flame danced wildly, guttering and struggling for oxygen. Methane. Jake's stomach twisted into a knot. Methane seepage, likely from an ancient, disturbed pocket under the earth, was accumulating under their home. Had it gone unnoticed any longer, a single spark could have turned the entire farmhouse into a fireball. Jake climbed out of the cellar 2 steps at a time. Outside, the wind tore at his jacket as he gathered Emily and Ellie into a fierce embrace. "We can't stay here," he said into Emily's hair voice rough. "It's not safe." She nodded, too overwhelmed to speak. Without wasting a second, they packed essentials into their truck. Ranger leaped into the back seat without needing a command, his entire body quivering with tension. Jake glanced back at the house one last time, a structure that had promised a new beginning, but had nearly delivered them into tragedy instead. They drove into town and checked into the only motel available, a rundown place called Pine Hollow Lodge, operated by a stooped old man named Bert. Bert had a permanent scowl etched into his wrinkled face and a limp that made his left shoe drag slightly across the floor. He asked no questions when Jake paid cash for a week's stay, only handed over the room key with a grunt. That evening, in the dim yellow light of their motel room, Jake sat awake while Emily and Ellie slept tangled together on the double bed. Ranger lay curled by the door, his breathing steady but watchful. Jake's mind drifted back to the deserts of the Middle East, to nights spent listening for the subtle rumble of distant mortars, the almost inaudible scrape of boots across sand. His instructors had called it listening to the earth, a skill few mastered, but one that had saved Jake's life more times than he cared to remember. Back then, he'd learned to trust signs that others ignored: the shift of dust, the whisper of disturbed air, the sudden, inexplicable stillness. It was that same instinct that had prickled at him these past weeks, the same bone-deep knowing that something was wrong even before the cracks appeared and the stains seeped and Ranger growled. Jake looked at Ranger now, the dog's thick chest rising and falling with each slow breath. His muzzle was beginning to frost with gray around the edges, but his spirit was as fierce as ever. "You knew," Jake whispered, a fierce gratitude tightening his throat. "You knew before any of us." The dog's ears twitched at the sound of his voice, but he didn't move. He didn't need to. The bond between them was deeper than words, deeper than logic. It was built of shared fear, loyalty forged under fire, and the unspoken promise that neither would ever abandon the other. In the days that followed, investigators confirmed Jake's findings. A geological inspection revealed a slow methane leak from an underground pocket that had likely been disturbed by recent earth movements. The inspector, a no-nonsense woman named Karen Trask, sturdy and square-jawed with a shock of graying black hair and a quick, efficient stride, commended Jake for acting quickly. "Another week, maybe 2, she said, scribbling notes into her battered clipboard. and you'd have had a different kind of emergency on your hands. Jake shuddered at the thought. They decided not to return to the farmhouse. It wasn't worth the risk or the memories now soaked into its walls. Instead, they focused on finding a new home, a place where the ground felt solid beneath their feet, and where the winds carried no whispered warnings. One night, as they sat on the motel bed flipping through listings, Emily looked up at Jake, her green eyes clear and shining despite the exhaustion. "How did you know?" she asked softly. Jake thought about it for a long moment before answering. "I didn't," he said finally. "I just listened. To the earth, to Ranger, to the things we usually ignore because they scare us." He reached out, brushing a strand of hair from Ellie's sleeping face. "And this time, I'm glad I was scared." Ranger thumped his tail once against the carpet as if in agreement. Outside the motel window, the winter wind still howled, but it no longer felt like a warning. It felt like a song of survival. The new house sat on the edge of Cheyenne, where the town melted into endless fields, and the sky seemed wide enough to swallow every sorrow. It wasn't much an aging ranch-style home with squeaky floors and faded shutters, but to the Carters it was a sanctuary. The earth beneath their feet felt steady solid. The air inside the house smelled of old cedar and morning light instead of mildew and hidden dangers. Ellie had regained her strength quickly, her cheeks once again rosy, her laughter ringing through the hallways like music. Ranger, ever her silent guardian, was never more than a few steps away from her at any time. His movements slow and deliberate, as though he understood just how precious she was. To celebrate Ellie's recovery, and to honor the unseen battle Ranger had fought and won, Emily and Jake decided to host a small gathering. Just close friends, a few neighbors, and those who had stood by them during the darkest nights. The living room was strung with simple decorations. White and silver streamers fluttered from the ceiling, and a handmade banner reading "Thank You, Ranger" hung over the fireplace. Emily baked a lopsided cake with uneven layers of chocolate and vanilla, and Jake grilled burgers on a battered old barbecue pit they had salvaged from a yard sale. As the first guests arrived, laughter and music filled the air, pushing back the lingering shadows of fear. Mrs. Harriet Collins came with a giant pot of her famous beef stew, grumbling good-naturedly about the cold. Her gray bun was tighter than ever, her movements brisk and efficient, but her eyes crinkled warmly whenever she looked at Ellie or Ranger. Tom Grady, the dog trainer, showed up wearing a clean plaid shirt and carrying a leather collar. He had tooled himself, stamped with Ranger's name and decorated with tiny silver stars. He was a wiry man, face lined by years of sun and squinting at distant horizons, but today his usually stern demeanor was softened by pride. Even Dr. Martha Green stopped by, her long red ponytail tucked into a wool cap, cheeks pink from the brisk air. She knelt to scratch Ranger's ears, murmuring praises about his instincts and courage. But it was Mr. Walker's arrival that caused the room to hush. The old man shuffled in, leaning heavily on a gnarled cane. His frame seemed thinner, his skin more translucent than before, as if the wind itself might blow him away. Yet his pale blue eyes were sharp as ever, and there was a spark of something new there, hope perhaps, or something even rarer, forgiveness. In his weathered hands he carried a small box wrapped carefully in brown paper and tied with twine. Mr. Walker made his way to where Ellie sat on a pile of cushions, clapping her hands and babbling happily at the flurry of attention. Ranger sat beside her, a steady rock in the sea of celebration. The old man knelt slowly, joints creaking, and set the box in front of Ellie. "For you, little one," he said, his voice rough as gravel but gentle. "From an old fool who should have believed sooner." Emily helped Ellie untie the twine and lift the lid. Inside nestled a delicate silver necklace, the pendant shaped like a small German shepherd, its surface gleaming softly in the firelight. A hush fell over the room as Mr. Walker spoke again, tears glistening in the corners of his eyes. "It's a charm," he explained hoarsely. "A promise that no matter where you go, someone somewhere will be watching over you." Emily pressed her hand to her mouth to stifle a sob. Jake reached for her free hand, squeezing it tightly. They understood the weight behind Mr. Walker's words, the decades of regret woven into that simple gift. Ellie giggled and waved the pendant in the air, oblivious to the emotion swirling around her. Mr. Walker chuckled a dry, wheezing sound that still somehow managed to lift the room and patted Ranger's massive head. "You," he said to the dog, "are worth 10 armies of men." Ranger responded by pressing his nose into the old man's chest, a gesture so tender it drew fresh tears from many watching. The rest of the evening unfolded in a dreamlike warmth. Stories were shared, laughter flowed freely, and for the first time in what felt like forever, the Carter family allowed themselves to breathe deeply, without fear. Jake stepped outside briefly, the cold night air bracing against his skin. Above him, the stars stretched on forever, brilliant and sharp. He found himself thinking about the countless nights he had stared up at foreign skies, wondering if he would ever find peace. He looked back through the window at the scene inside Emily laughing with Mrs. Collins, Ellie waving her silver charm at Tom Grady Ranger, lying contentedly with his head in Mr. Walker's lap. Jake smiled a rare, full smile that reached his eyes. Inside the house above the mantel, Emily had hung a new sign. It was simple, just one word carved into a piece of driftwood. "Guardian." Jake whispered it under his breath, feeling the truth of it settle deep into his bones. Inside, Ranger shifted slightly but didn't wake. His ears twitched once as if acknowledging Jake's thought, then settled back into peaceful stillness. He was more than just a dog. He was the keeper of dreams. And as long as he drew breath, no harm would find them again. Sometimes miracles do not come with thunder or lightning. Sometimes they arrive softly wrapped in fur, carried by loyal hearts, and guided by the unseen hand of God. Ranger was not just a dog. He was a living reminder that when we open our hearts, when we listen to the whispers of the world, and trust what we cannot see, we find that heaven often sends its guardians in ways we least expect. In our everyday lives, it is easy to overlook the quiet blessings, the loved ones who stand watch when we are weak, the friends who reach out when we are lost, the faithful companions who sense our needs before we ever speak them aloud. Never doubt that God is working through them, weaving threads of protection, love, and redemption into the fabric of our days. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone you love. Leave a comment below and type "Amen" if you believe that God still sends His angels to walk beside us. Do not forget to like this video, subscribe to our channel for more inspiring stories, and may God's grace and blessings always surround you.